So, shall I tell you some stories? Because after all, as Galeano says, scientists say that human beings are made of atoms, but a little bird told me that we are also made of stories. It is an honor to be back in Beirut, to be with you at AUB, where I had the pleasure of teaching and learning. This is a city that I love deeply. It reminds me of my hometown, Calcutta, both colonial port cities of Asia, both cities that have been racked by different kinds of wars. I have an emotional attachment to Beirut as well because it gave refuge to the Pakistani poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, whose writings inspire my thinking. Faiz spent some crucial years here, writing about Beirut, a city that he saw being battered in 1982 by the Israeli war machine, and about Palestine. The poems on Palestine speak not only to the exile of the Palestinians and their struggle, but to Faiz's own exile from a Pakistan eaten then by a US-backed military dictatorship that was against all that is good in the world and that promotes all that suffocates us: money, fundamentalism, and guns. So Faiz in Beirut would sing, दूर परदेश की बेमहर गुज़रगाहों में, अजनबी शहर की बेनाम व निशान रहूं में, जिस ज़मीन पर भी खुला मेरे लहू का परचम, ले लेता है वहाँ अर्ज़ फ़लस्तीन का अलीम. Far away on the unkind roads of distant lands, through unmarked, unnamed lanes of strange cities, wherever the banner of my blood unfurled, there flutters the flag of Palestine. When I came to Beirut to give a lecture about 5 or 6 years ago, I made sure to translate Faiz's poem for Beirut, Ornament of the World, he called it. Ye shahar azal se kayam hai, ye shahar abad tak dayam hai. This city stands at time's creation, this city will stand at time's end. Faiz was here as the editor of Lotus, the magazine of the Afro-Asian world, the magazine by then of the Third World, of the Tricontinental. These are deeply resonant associations for me, which is why I'm so glad to be so ensconced in my new project, one that seeks to develop empirical and theoretical knowledge for political movements that work in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Movements that seek to overturn the present and create a just future. So, to Beirut, to Faiz, to Nadeem Makdisi, who studied at AUB, who worked as a professional journalist, to tell the truth. To tell the truth, the first casualty of war and business. Truth is the first casualty of war and business. Not just war, but also business. Money tends to corral ideas, pushing its own agenda through the mass media. This is what I learned not merely from reading the great work of Herbert Schiller and Ben Bagdikian, but also from the newsrooms where I began work almost 30 years ago. I went into these newsrooms by accident. I was studying for my PhD when I found myself dragged back to my schoolboy passion of reporting. I was doing a study of an oppressed caste community when the political party that currently rules India dragged northern India into a terrible riot. These were the riots of 1992-93. I was in Silampur, on the edge of Delhi, interviewing sanitation workers when the riots broke out. The newspaper I was then associated with asked me to file some stories from this area, where the riot was particularly hideous. This was a riot against working-class Muslims, where the attackers were working-class people of oppressed caste backgrounds. This was exactly what my dissertation was about: working-class people attacking working-class people for someone else's gain. It was where I learned to report difficult and dangerous stories. The army, the extract has disappeared, but never mind. The army had declared a curfew with an order to shoot at sight. I took refuge in a temple of the oppressed castes. A few hours after I was in the temple, there was a loud knock on the door. The pujari, the priest, opened the door and welcomed in a group of killers. They came with their machetes and their knives, blood in their eyes, the smell of death on their skin. I killed many, said one young man with mischief on his person. When night fell, there was another knock on the door. An old woman stepped in, handed something to one of the men, and vanished into the night. She took a great risk to be there. After all, the order was shoot at sight. No army man would ask her why she was outside. They would simply shoot, as they often did. The parcel was handed to the leader of this gang of killers. I saw him take out a syringe and a plastic bag, and then shoot himself in the arm. The old woman was his mother. She had brought him his heroin. No one wants to print a story like that. These were foot soldiers of a powerful political movement backed by a section of the business elites. What the papers wanted to print, and what they did print, was that these riots developed out of a sense of frustration by the Hindu population against Muslims, as if to justify the riots. When the leaders of the Hindu right said that the riots came as a response to the bomb blast in Bombay in 1993, the papers later reported this as if it were true. In fact, the bomb blast took place on March 12, 1993. The riots took place in December 1992 and January 1993. The provocations of the Hindu right through 1992 and the destruction of a 16th century mosque by the Hindu right created the context for the riots. All these vanished. Our papers reported the violence as if they were a fact of nature, things that happen, things that need no explanation. Rally around the police, the forces of law and order, hope that sane minds prevail. No need to deepen our understanding of what happened. No need, in fact, to understand the foot soldiers of this violence and to trace their relationship with the local power brokers and the national political parties. Truth is bad for business. Truth is the first casualty of war and business. Not just war, but also business. There is hypocrisy and ugliness in the way we read about our reality. Both North Korea and South Korea are eager to make peace. There are 75 million people in the Korean peninsula. They want something other than the tension that has existed for 6 decades. They no longer want to be held hostage by someone else's politics. Even the Japanese have indicated that they want to open a genuine dialogue with North Korea. The United States is stubborn. It does not seem to want peace in the Korean peninsula. It seems to want the North Koreans to surrender or to be annihilated. This is what the North Koreans believe. A senior North Korean diplomat told me that he worries that the United States wants to provoke his country to war and then destroy it entirely. He looks toward Iraq and Libya for the future of his country. Neither are positive examples. Then, as if from nowhere, a story appears that North Korea apparently has continued to sell the components for chemical weapons to Syria. What is the evidence? A United Nations report that has not been released, the word of a US State Department veteran who was on a previous UN panel and shared his suspicions with the press, and unidentified United Nations member states. This is the level of the information. The New York Times journalist who wrote this story has not seen the UN report, which is unreleased, but he had spoken to William Newcomb, who was deputy coordinator of the US State Department's North Korea Working Group, and he cited the unidentified UN member state. The headline for the New York Times story is startling. UN links North Korea to Syria's chemical weapons program. The headline has no hesitation. It is conclusive. The reader will see North Korea, Syria, and chemical weapons. The associations are clear. That North Korea denied the story does not appear in a headline. There is no evidence that the Times talked to the North Koreans. North Koreans say they didn't talk to them. Nor is there evidence that they talked to the Syrians. The journalists interviewed US State Department officials, UN officials, and former US State Department officials. That's it. That's the story. This is when journalism becomes stenography, when you sit with your notepad and write your story out of the mouth of officials from powerful countries. You accept their bona fides, they are never wrong. When US aircraft drop bomb on civilians, that is an accident. When Syrian aircraft drops bombs on civilians, that is purposeful. Underneath these words lies ideology, old colonial ideology. No one is saying that the North Koreans and the Syrians are virtuous, but certainly their views should be part of the framing of a story, even if their views are pilloried and held to account. But there is no need to talk to the North Koreans. The impression of North Korea and Syria is so overdetermined that there is no need to investigate anything. One can say anything about North Korea and get away with it. In 2011, Isaac Stone Fisher of Newsweek admitted, after months of research, I have to admit that I have no idea what is actually happening inside North Korea. He blamed it on North Korea. Although, to be clear, the door to North Korea is not closed off entirely. Journalists from elsewhere than the United States and Europe go to the North. For instance, for a dossier we produced for Tricontinental, we used the photographs of Rafael Stedil, a Brazilian photojournalist who traveled through North Korea in July 2017. If you go on the internet, you will find many stories written by Western journalists that say photography is banned in North Korea. Pictures that Kim Jong-un doesn't want you to see, screams the clickbait headline. But this is not entirely true. It merely reproduces the idea that North Korea is, as Fisher wrote, in a Stalinist time warp and is inaccessible. Why bother trying to understand the context when you can merely reproduce the ideology of the powerful states? I was struck to read a headline recently that said, Ivanka Trump in South Korea calls for pressure on the North. Ivanka Trump. Better talk to her to find out what is happening in North Korea. No need to try and interview the North Korean delegation that came to South Korea for the Olympics and made itself available to the media. Why bother with them, robots from a country that needs to be bombed to become free? You might recall that on October 4th, 2017, a US soldier was killed in Niger. What struck me as astounding was that US Senator Lindsey Graham of the Senate's Committee on Armed Services would say, I didn't know there were 1,000 troops in Niger. He meant US troops. The US media followed suit. So did the Europeans. So did the media of the Global South that takes its cues from the Western media. If they ran the story, it was through being dumbfounded by the death. The soldier was killed near the town of Tongo Tongo, along Niger's border with Mali. This town is in the middle of a belt that is ground zero to the traffic of a series of commodities that have begun to define the Sahel and the Sahara. You have cocaine, of course. Success by United States policy has slowed down cocaine's journey from Colombia to the United States through Central America, which is why the cocaine cartels have moved their operations to North Africa, carting vast amounts of the drug by plane into Mali and Niger. The name of the airline is called Air Cocaine. Then sending it across the Sahara by individual carters, then across the Mediterranean to European markets and to Rotterdam, from where it is shipped to the United States. A walk through Gao in Mali and Agadez in Niger shows plainly the cocaine wealth. A neighborhood in Gao is called Cocaine Bougou. A leading politician who died in 2016 was known as Mr. Cocaine or Sheriff Cocaine. Billions of dollars of cocaine moved through the Sahel into Europe. You have cocaine, but you have uranium, of course. Niger's town of Arlit is one of the world's key sources of uranium. You might remember that the United States accused Saddam Hussein's government of procuring yellow cake uranium from Niger. That turned out to be a hoax uncovered by US Ambassador Joe Wilson when he went to Niger and met various people, including the former president. The accusations against Iraq was false, but Arlit's mines are real. The town is a fortress of European, mainly French mining firms, such as Areva. The town out of Arlit is known as Uranium Highway. See the pattern here? We've got Sheriff Cocaine, Cocaineville, and then Uranium Highway. But you don't read about this stuff in the media. I'm coming back to the story in a second of the soldier. The uranium of Arlit powers 1 in 3 light bulbs in France. That's a lot of light bulbs. You have cocaine, you have uranium, and you have refugees, of course. And they, unlike cocaine and uranium, make the news. They make the news because they come to Europe and interrupt the fantasy of Europe's social cohesion. Since the early days of colonialism, Europe has broadcast itself as a land of milk and honey. Old colonial ideas and the wealth of Europe, built from colonial labor, beckons those whose lives have been destroyed by adverse policies of trade and war. It is a siren for the wretched of the earth. Refugees do not show up in the Mediterranean Sea as if from nowhere. By the time they get into their flimsy boats on the Libyan coastline, they have lived many, many dangerous lives. They have left increasingly unproductive fields in Western and Eastern Africa, fled wars in the Horn of Africa and Sudan and Syria, as well as places as far off as Afghanistan, and traveled great distances to get to what they see as the final leg of their journey. Sadly, for many Africans, the journey ends in virtual concentration camps in Libya, where refugees that Europe does not want now linger, some sold into slavery. To get to Libya, the migrants and refugees have to cross the Sahara Desert. A journey in a pickup truck takes 3 days at least. It is perilous. The refugees, and sometimes the cocaine mules, could find themselves dying from dehydration, extremists, smugglers, or the security forces, including Western security forces in the region. The Sahara is vast, hot, and dangerous. Old salt caravans, the Azalai, mostly managed by the Tuareg peoples, used to run across the desert. They sometimes still move carrying gold, weapons, and human beings. These caravans move from water source to water source, the camels as exhausted as the Tuareg. Newer caravans prefer buses, pickup trucks, and jeeps to ferry humans and cocaine towards Europe, guns and money southward. These newer caravans drive along unmarked paths, heading between sand dunes, searching for old tire tracks that have been buried in the disorienting sandstorms. The migrants huddle in the trucks. They are wearing sunglasses, their only defense in the desert. No proper account exists for dead refugees. When a boat sinks in the Mediterranean Sea, it is within sight of Europe. When refugees die in the desert, no one seems to care. Why do they come? Because their countries have been wiped out, destroyed by unfair trade policies and by the sequestration of wealth into the hands of a few. In 2003, the presidents of Mali and Burkina Faso wrote an impassioned article titled, "Your Farm Subsidies Are Strangling Us." In this article, they said that for their region, cotton is the ticket into the world market. Its production is crucial to economic development in West and Central Africa, as well as to the livelihood of millions of people there. But this industrial sector was placed in grave threat by the trade policies pushed by the West through the World Trade Organization. This vital sector in our countries, wrote these heads of government, is seriously threatened by agricultural subsidies granted by rich countries to their cotton producers. In 2001, for instance, cotton subsidies in the West amounted to $5.8 billion. In that same period, 2001, the US government alone, provided its 25,000 cotton farmers $3 billion in subsidy relief. That $3 billion was more than the entire economic output of the 20 million people of Burkina Faso. These subsidies undermined the cotton producers in Africa. It is what has contributed to the destruction of West Africa's economy and set in motion this refugee crisis. Trade wars are real wars. Subsidy regimes are like bombing runs. 2.5 million Malians live with chronic hunger. 3 out of 10 Malian children are chronically undernourished. 4 out of every 5 Malian children are anemic. Let me repeat that last one. 4 out of 5 Malian children are anemic. 1 in 4 Malian children is stunted. Mali's Minister of Economy and Finance, Boubou Cissé, came to his office from the World Bank. This is not somebody who doesn't understand the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. He's not unsympathetic to capitalism and so on. So Boubou Cissé himself is dispirited by the crisis. Malnutrition killed, he said last year, and it kills a lot. The men and women who survive are affected for the rest of their lives. The crisis produced by trade policy is not only morally unacceptable, said Cissé, but what is at stake is our national economic survival. What has been the West's answer to this crisis? Not to revise trade policies, not to see the refugee crisis as a symptom of a broken global economy, not even to see that about half of Africa's refugees and migrants move within the continent and not towards the West. Along the Sahel, from Mauritania to Chad, the Europeans and the Americans have begun to build what amounts to a highly militarized border. Europe has moved its border from the northern edge of the Mediterranean Sea to the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, and it has thereby compromised the sovereignty of North Africa. France, by itself, has created the G5 Sahel initiative that has yoked 5 African countries into a so-called partnership that allows French military bases and troops to police this region. The United States has built one of its largest military bases in Agadez, in Niger, from where its special forces operate in the Sahel and from where it flies armed drones across the region. This is in addition to a US military base, largely unmentioned, in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, and other bases from Dire Dawa in Somalia to N'Djamena in Chad. The Europeans and the Americans say that this has to do with the war on terror, that the enemies of freedom, al-Qaida in the Maghreb, must be held in check or destroyed. But who are these terrorists? Amongst them are certainly hardened fighters, led by men experienced in the US-led jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s, now freshly armed and given buoyancy by the destruction of Libya. These are men like Mukhtar Belmokhtar and Abdel Malik Drukdel, eager to overthrow the government in Algeria by conducting sabotage operations against Algerian energy fields, such as in Amina's Algeria in 2013. But the work of these groups is not militancy of a conventional sort. Al-Qaida in this region is the preeminent smuggler of cigarettes, as well as the main organizer of a protection racket for the smugglers, taking a tax of between 10 and 15% of their product. Most of their foot soldiers are motivated by smuggling rather than theology. It is as likely that the shootout near Tongo Tongo was between smugglers and the American troops than Al-Qaida and the American troops. The war on terror is evoked each time an American shoots a gun. Neither an open border, nor a closed border, nor a drone base, nor a special operations force will end this flow of refugees into the dangerous desert. The root cause of the conflicts is the same as everywhere: environmental destruction and climate change, and the vagaries of private appropriation by the few of the social wealth produced by the many, what we call capitalism. These causes produce war and desolation, drive the poor to blame other poor people on ethnic or religious lines for their grievances, push the world to war and fanaticism, which in turn allows mendacious states to use conflict as a reason to offer a military solution to every problem. A CIA agent once told me in Afghanistan, if you have a hammer, why not use it? More is spent on military forces than on human security. A 2016 report from the Institute for Economics and Peace showed that the total cost of the infrastructure of state violence per year is about $13.6 trillion, with half of this, $6.6 trillion, going to military expenditure, and a quarter of this, $3.5 trillion, going to internal security. The total cost of violence amounts to 13.3%. This figure is very important. I know that when anybody says figures, your mind goes blank and you are in terror of the numbers. But I just want you to concentrate on this piece of information. The total cost of violence amounts to 13.3% of the world's gross domestic product. So the number to keep in mind is 13.3% of the world's gross domestic product. The stated commitment by the so-called member states of the United Nations, the stated commitment of the member states of the United Nations for official development aid is merely 0.7% of gross domestic product. And most countries are at 0.2%, if not lower. 13.3% to war. Supposedly 0.7% to development. This discrepancy between aid and violence shows that the marketplace for justice has failed. The policy framework that we have in the world has little answer to the widening inequality gap and the deepening sense of despair that grips large parts of the planet. Guns intimidate people, but they do not provide them with any hope for a better future. No one will report that in July of last year in Tunis, sensitive and decent people formed the North African Network for Food Sovereignty. Nor will there be any reflection on the assassination of hope for the region that includes the assassination of Thomas Sankara, President of Burkina Faso, on October 15, 1987. Sankara, largely forgotten outside Burkina Faso, offered an alternative to the kind of deleterious trade policies and war-making culture that has now swept the world. We must dare to invest and invent the future, Sankara said. What lies before us is not the future, it is wretched. A few years ago, that would have been a great place to end, by the way. The future is wretched. A few years ago, I was in an al-Qaida encampment in the Kalamun region of Western Syria. The chief of that group asked me about Hindi films. He was an aficionado and had many films downloaded on his laptop. It was his distraction from the perils of close combat. Who is your favorite film star? He asked casually. I was scared to say any name because if I gave the wrong name, men with guns should never be answered quickly. To fill the uncomfortable silence, he said, with a smile actually, should I tell you my favorite? Which takes the sting out of the problem now. It went on from there. A discussion of this film and that film. It was surprising that many of these men, plucked from as far afield as North Africa and from Central Asia, enjoyed sentimental Hindi films. In a quiet moment, away from the others, an Algerian man began to sing a song that was hard to identify. His accent was too strong, and of course mine is too strong for him, but his accent was very strong, singing a Hindi song, and he had garbled the Hindi words. It took a while to figure out that he was singing Jaane Tu Ya Jaane Na from Aa Gale Lag Ja, 1973. Sung by Kishore Kumar and starring Shashi Kapoor, who died very recently, beautiful Shashi Kapoor, and Sharmila Tagore, dancing in the snow. This song has a lovely, catchy chorus. I'm not singing it for you, but I could if you threatened me. In this remote camp of hardened fighters, an Algerian expatriate wanted to talk about a film that he knew only by the first two words of its hit song, Jaane Tu. The Bangladeshi filmmaker Naeem Mohamed and I were in Algeria 2 years ago or 3 years ago to shoot his new film that showcases the 1973 non-aligned movement meeting in Algiers, 2 meetings and a funeral. Film, by the way, is at the Beirut Arts Center, and it'll run there till April 9th. So if you're interested in seeing it, it's a 3-channel movie. It's quite interesting. I'm wearing the same clothes today as I wear in the film. So I do have other clothes, just in case. But I have worn this jacket for over 20 years. It tells you how much journalism pays. That it's the same jacket 20 years ago made by a tailor. Now you'll say here, a jacket made by a tailor. In India, it was cheaper to have a jacket made by a tailor than to buy it off the shelf, by the way, just so you understand economics and the price of labor. Naeem and I traveled across the city, Algiers, meeting a range of people and visiting the sites of that historical NAM meeting. It was at this conference that the third world countries pledged to push for a new international economic order. The charismatic Algerian leader, Boumediene, urged the NAM members to be far more confrontational on the world stage against imperialism. Boumediene backed the freedom fighters of his time, from the Palestinians to the South Africans. These were fighters from a different era, sharing only the gun with the al-Qaida guerrillas along the western flank of Syria. The line that runs from Boumediene to the al-Qaida leader in Syria, Julani, is broken. Naeem's film recovers the period when that older order in the third world began to fray and the current malignancies began to emerge. Boumediene, like so many radicals, would die in mysterious circumstances in 1978, a decade before the assassination of Sankara, a decade after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. If Europe underdeveloped Africa, as Walter Rodney, himself assassinated in 1980, wrote, then the Western powers and their friends assassinated hope in the post-colonial continent and replaced it with violence and despair. For at least 2 decades, I have walked this landscape of desolation, from Afghanistan to Iraq, to Yemen to Sudan, where once the left was strong, but then the left was actively destroyed. I have been in search of people like Fahad of Iraq, murdered in 1949, Abdul Khalik Mahgoub of Sudan, murdered in 1971, Mahdi Amal, murdered down the street, 1987. It's a memoir by his wife, Evelyn. Mahdi Amal, murdered down the street in 1987. Amina Rahal, Fatima Ibrahim, comrades from Iran to Morocco. Amin Hatoun, a young Algerian filmmaker, made a short film a few years ago called Nostalgic Laziness. In this 1-minute film, which I'll show you, we see a man lying on a bed with a television set in front of him. You first see a news report of the Arab Spring protests, with the reporter commenting how Algerians, exhausted by their civil war in the 1990s, had no desire for an upheaval. The man changes the channel. Shashi Kapoor appears. He is singing, "Aaye mere bete, sun mera kehna," from the film "Aa Gale Lag Ja." The father in the film, in this song, tells the son to listen to him and warns him, essentially, against chaos. Syrupy nostalgia overcomes political protest. Protests that are unprepared are not always going to be successful. They can end smothered by older logics, congealed power equations that have not been shifted. The revolutionary movements of the 20th century picked up Marx's Capital or Mao's Red Book, listened to Castro's speeches, and adopted Ho Chi Minh as their icon. Those movements had a theory of the present that was rooted in its contradictions, and so proposed to move the dialectic forward toward a socialist alternative. That agenda, while still alive in sections of the world, went by the wayside. These are my comrades. They just won a huge victory in Maharashtra. 100,000 farmers came to the city of Mumbai, choked the city, and forced the right-wing chief minister to accept all their demands. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. Imperialism's support of religious and ethnic parties to destroy Marxist and left movements and revolutionary nationalist movements paid off. If these new struggles have a theory, it is often rooted in texts of millenarianism, forms of this faith here or that faith there, charismatic warlords here or gang leaders there. Theories of the present are often cast aside. Older neighborhoods of the Iraqi Communist Party turned themselves into stalwarts of Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army, while areas loyal to the Bombay Textile Workers Communist Union turned toward the right-wing Shiv Sena. Gang lords and warlords moved into areas that once gave people hope and dreams, including dreams of a kind of socialism. I started this talk with Faiz Ahmed Faiz, whose poems for Palestine were published in 1981 in a collection called Mere Dil, Mere Musafir, My Heart, My Traveler, a book Faiz dedicated to Yasser Arafat. In 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, Pakistan's ambassador came and begged Faiz to join him in East Beirut. But Faiz would not go. He would later write to his wife Alice, "I could have done the same as the Pakistani ambassador, but the heart didn't agree to let the side down." What the poor Palestinians and Lebanese and the city went through, he wrote, beggars description. Azam Khan from the United Nations eventually came and whisked Faiz off to Damascus, where he took up residence in Hotel Meridian near Umayyad Square and had a hot bath after 10 days. He knew what it meant to live inside the wounds of our world. Now, so many wounds. In one of his most powerful poems for Palestine, Faiz had written, "Tere आका ने किया एक फिलिस्तीन बर्बाद, मेरे जख्मों ने किया कितने फिलिस्तीन आबाद." Your enemies destroyed one Palestine. My wounds populated many Palestines. The bad side of history might destroy the world, but each of the wounds it makes produces, by the logic of contradictions, its own gravediggers. Wounds, in other words, populate the land called freedom. May it be so. Thanks a lot. The question of how stories are remembered is as important as how we tell stories now. So the relationship between history and news is, I think, fundamental. It strikes me as completely surprising how in our profession, increasingly, our colleagues don't want to read history. they read travel books when they go places. So what's in your backpack? It's a travel book, and I was quite surprised in the aftermath of Iraq war, some journalists in Iraq carrying in their backpack books by Gertrude Bell and so on. I mean, there are actually more. There was Charles Tripp's book, which is the Cambridge history of Iraq, essentially. It's not a bad book. Why don't you read that? They are carrying books from the colonial days to understand Iraq. That was bizarre, for 2003, but not really. It's either that or it's Lonely Planet. So the relationship of how you tell the story of now is so rooted in how you understand the past, and therefore from what perspective you understand the past. And I think it's not fashionable to talk about the anti-colonial perspective. And I think that's what I meant by covering it from the global south. It's the anti-colonial perspective that is so deeply unfashionable. You sound like a hectoring person when you apparently keep going back to the past. Like, why can't we stay in the present? Why do you have to read about the history of Syria to understand what's happening in Syria? All you need to understand is Assad is a butcher. If you get that Assad is a butcher, then that's the ticket to entry into the conversation at the Carnegies, in the New York Times. That's a ticket of entry. You don't need to study the history, the complexity. You don't have to understand that Assad is a product of a history. You just have to say he's a butcher, and then the story writes itself. Then you have to say, well, look, it's civilians dying. So it's the question of perspective, of this anti-colonial perspective that I think should define our kind of counter-journalism or the journalism from the other side. I just want to say that I'm largely write for mainstream publications in India. I don't write I write for what's known as India's leading news magazine. And I've written for them for 25 years every fortnight. I've written for every fortnight for 25 years. You count how many articles that is. From, Chiapas to Iraq. I've covered all these things, from FARC in Colombia. It's a great ride, friends. Have enjoyed it thoroughly. But, my editor would not understand an article if the premise of the article was that history doesn't matter. Nor would my readers, frankly. They would be bewildered by an ahistorical understanding of the present. And that has to do with the residues of anti-colonial perspective in our society. Those residues have never been there in France. French people are taught to believe they are a republic. How are you a republic? Drop of a hat, you'll bomb Côte d'Ivoire, you'll bomb Mali, you'll have the French franc be the currency of the African countries that speak French. How are you a republic? Where is the Republican thing, friends? Go back, read about Haiti. So I'll meet my French colleagues and I'll say, guys, you're colonialists. As they say in the movie Black Panther, don't scare me, colonizer. If you have weak states and weak regionalism, and your regionalism is not allowed to develop effectively, this is what's going to happen. Look at the Arab League. Where is the history of the Arab League that is an honest history? You go back and you read what some of the more revolutionary people used to say of the Arab League. They would say things like, don't bother to bomb Israel, go bomb that building in downtown Cairo. In other words, the Arab League. It's ineffectual, it's unable to bring people. But the Arab League was merely the mirror of unfinished problems in this region. In other words, what was the Arab League? You've been to enough meetings to know there were always two sections. The Saudi-led section, and then for years the Algerian-led section. The kind of revolutionary, secular, nationalist crowd, and then the Emiratis, the this, the that. You cannot have a weak region and not have external powers enter. You know, if you look at other countries, other areas, they fight off. I mean, in that sense, there is really something to be learned from what the Chinese are now doing in Eastern Asia. And how the Chinese have been pushing to break ASEAN, APEC, all these groupings that have Western intervention. There's something to be learned from why the Bolivarian project wanted to destroy the free trade area of the Americas. That was one of the first things Chavez, Morales, etc. did in the early 2000s, and replace it with ALBA, their own formation. And they forced the Organization of American States to accept Cuba for the first time and to say the Americans don't have a seat at the table because this is our regional organization. It makes no sense in South America and Central America to have the United States at the table. If you have the United States, why not Canada? You know, why not have the whole hemisphere? And then why can't the OAS pass resolutions about, you know, Flint, Michigan, water crisis? You know, Americans should not neglect their population. Why is it that OAS is always criticizing Mexico, which, by the way, deserves to be criticized? So the question was not about, you know, what they say. I'm not talking about the politics. I'm talking about the regional integrity. You have to have a strong sense of being in the region. And so when they got rid of the American seat briefly, and the Cubans came on board, that was in a way the high point of South American or Latin American integration. High point. But of course it went downhill from there. But what I'm saying, Rami, is that in a way, of course they'll intervene. Big powers always intervene. In the case of the Russians, the interesting phenomena is that in this part of the world, writing about Russia has been, I think, quite parochial. It's been about Russia in Syria. But if you look at Russia globally, Russia has, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, only 2 warm water ports. One was in Crimea, in Sevastopol, and one was in Syria, in the province of Latakia. It's interesting that both these warm water ports were threatened in the second term of the Obama administration. When the United States government helped overthrow the Russian-backed government in Ukraine, they were going to lose Sevastopol. And then in Syria, if there was a change of guard, they would have lost Tartus port. So the Russians were interested in maintaining their 2 ports. They have no other warm water ports. That is, in the Pacific Ocean, those ports freeze in the winter. The Americans, meanwhile, have over 100 warm water ports, including in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, from which the bombing runs on Iraq were made. Island where there's still a court case going on in London, brought by the Chagos Islanders. They are the ones who were displaced from the base by the British. In what the British and Europeans call Diego Garcia, they call it Chagos. That's another warm water. The Russians had 2. Now, I'm not carrying a bucket for the Russians. These conversations are so ugly because if you say anything to push back against something, right, you get, oh my God, but then you are a Putin supporter or whatever. I'm a supporter of nobody. But here, you see, the point is, we have to understand what their game is. And there is an opening. I mean, the question is, why are there so many foreign military ports in the Middle East, Rami? That's the question. I mean, in Qatar, I was once driving in the desert with a taxi, a South Asian taxi driver. I said to him, drive me to the border of Saudi Arabia. Okay, let's just go for a drive. Why? Along the way, you may not know, but you pass American base. About several miles before the base, a jeep pulled up and stopped us and said, you can't go any further. They were Americans. I thought this is supposed to be some sort of country called Qatar. God knows what kind of country it is. In South Korea, in the malls, you go to buy a ticket to see a movie, in the line there'll be American soldiers armed. Imagine in Beirut, if there were at the mall Chinese soldiers with guns in the queue to see Black Panther. That would shock you, you know. Or Russian soldiers standing in the queue, just routinely going to see a film, armed. So there is a very strange way in which you have allowed your region to become the lily pads of violence, from one end of the region to the other. This goes back to World War II, some of it, to British bases and so on. You've never reclaimed your territory. I mean, the Cubans from 1959 have been fighting to remove the US base in Guantanamo. From 59. I have never really heard of a struggle in this region, Rami, to remove a base. I've never heard of a struggle. Never. In fact, in Africa, when the Americans created AFRICOM, African Command, no African country would publicly allow African Command to come, which is why it's based in Stuttgart. There are tons of American bases that I have seen in Africa. The African countries are too embarrassed to allow it to be made public. In Agadez, the base, as I said, is the biggest base. You can go to Google Earth and see it. It's one of the largest bases in the world. It was built only for merely $100 million. That's because the price of labor in Niger is nothing. So the point I'm trying to make is you open the door, they're going to come in. And you're not standing up for yourself. So in the end, what's happening in Astana is the top of the iceberg. Underneath that is this deep rot of the lack of confidence to say we want our sovereignty back.
Where do you come from in terms of what you stand for? In other words, a few minutes ago you said, no, I'm not an apologist for Russia. And throughout the talk we see there are times when you seem to make a stand for the global South, other times for regionalism, other times for communism, other times for nationalism, other times for anti-colonialism, other times for a general notion of freedom, which kind of sits in a liberal humanist framework. And so I think I'd just like to hear a little bit more about where you come from.
Oh, I like that question a lot, yeah. It's true that the left is suffering a major defeat in Latin America. It's completely true. There are, I think, it'll take time to analyze exactly, precisely what has happened. I've been going recently to Brazil a fair amount. And Brazil, there was a kind of soft coup, in a way, against the Lula establishment. Lula was already out of thing. Dilma was, I think, very viciously removed from power by a man, with ancestry. How can I not indicate this ancestry from Lebanon? Mr. Temer, who is one of the most unpopular people in Brazil. Not just political leader, but I think he's even more unpopular than the gangsters that are there. In fact, if the election was now, Lula would win by a landslide. But they are trying through legal means to prevent him from standing, which is a very interesting mechanism. So one of the fascinating, or two of the most important aspects, I think, to research more, and I'm not making these conclusive statements. One is that none of these countries produced a revolution, in the sense that in none of the countries, the deepest of which was Venezuela, none of these countries was the elite expropriated. In none of the countries did they lose their wealth. In none of the countries did the media get democratized in small d terms. In other words, in Brazil, the major media outlet is Globo. And Globo just has its own agenda. And at no point did these governments, no point were they strong enough to actually produce an alternative media. Telesur, based in Ecuador, is not an alternative to Globo. Telesur is a concept. You cannot build a media company based on a concept. The only place it has succeeded is from Qatar. And that has to do with enormous piles of inexhaustible wealth. The second thing to investigate, so the first is, this was not really a revolution in the sense that they expropriated people. There was no guillotine in the center of Caracas. Okay? Not that that's a way to go forward, guys. I don't mean that. I'm just saying that they didn't expropriate. Second thing, I mean, there was the trivial expropriation, with Chavez on Alo Presidente walking around saying, expropriate, expropriate. That's a joke, man. That was like some small shop knocked down so that Bolivar's house looks better. And it was made a big deal of. But there was no real expropriation. Second thing is that they relied on commodity prices. When commodity prices are high, it's easy to be spending lavishly, building Telesur. When commodity prices collapse, you are in distress. You cannot build a revolution grounded on commodity prices. And I think those are the two things we need to investigate. What are the alternatives? I can go on at length. I once had a conversation with an agricultural department person in Caracas about why Venezuelans eat so much pasta. And that was fascinating, because it's one of the countries per capita greatest eating of pasta, right? What do you want for dinner? Pasta. I mean, who the hell are you, Venezuelans, eating pasta? Eat your bloody grains that are now so healthy, the kind of local variant of quinoa and so on. But, that's another story. But it comes to commodity prices, because you can then import everything. You cannot live in this world importing everything. You cannot import your dreams. You have to create them yourself. So how can you defend Venezuela? What are you defending is really the question. No, I'm not saying how can you defend, like Venezuela is so bad you can't defend. I'm not saying that. It's what is being defended. You see, Brazil, for instance, I had done a couple of stories on the FOME, the Zero Hunger program. Brazil got very little press coverage for this, but one of the things they did was they were able to reduce hunger. And the way they did this is they created a massive malnutrition scheme, feeding poor, making sure that people were able to get access to food, healthy food and so on. And for that very brief decade, hunger rates declined, meaning people were eating. And after Temer, you see the hunger rate creeping upward. So what are we defending? You're not defending Lula, person, Maduro, a person. You don't care. You're defending those programs. Those programs meant life or death for people. They're social democratic programs. They meant life or death for people. You'll see a return of the worst kind of social indicators when all these governments' records starts to come out. What's going to happen in Argentina? Let's wait and see. Let's see what this government is capable, Macri's government is capable of doing to the people of Argentina, who came out of, you may remember, governments that lasted 3 days, 5 days in 2002, piqueteros banging their things, So what I'm saying is, what is to be defended? The framework to that must always be, what are the details? Not, let's have a broad discussion about Venezuela as a, Brazil, Bolivarian. What are the details? What has to be defended? The integrity of the region must be defended. Otherwise you're going to open yourself up to a new base. Why just Paraguay, where there's a US base? Why not some more bases in Brazil, Venezuela? Why not let other powers have conversations in Washington or Moscow or wherever and make decisions for you? Is that the democracy you want? Is that what we mean by democracy post-collapse of the Soviet Union? That we have elections, but somebody else makes our decisions for us. That's what democracy is coming to look like increasingly. So, who are you? I personally am a Marxist. That's my orientation, political, theoretical orientation. Which is why I'm very interested in the idea of context and setting context and perspective and so on. But I'm all the things you said. I'm all those things. May not be liberal humanist. I'll sort of draw the line there. But I'm all those things in the sense that, I read the work of somebody like, say, Frantz Fanon, and I find that to be stimulating for me personally, intellectually, and I look at the work of the All India Women's Democratic Association, and I see how they have developed an analysis of why it is that, women's freedom in India is compromised. And I think, wow, they are intellectuals that I should pay attention to. But more than anything else, I think the question isn't what label you have or, your framework you have. The real question is, do you believe firmly that indignity is completely unacceptable in our world? That it's not a question of should people eat or whatever, but do you believe that people should live dignified lives? Now, if that's not your belief, then it's a struggle. If that is too vague an idea, an idea that everybody agrees with, what's that Janis Joplin song? Freedom is another word with, whatever it is. Yeah, nothing left to lose. I mean, I got it. Dignity, everybody agrees with dignity. Actually, that's not true. What was the slogan from Egypt? I mean, dignity is not so easy, friends. Soviet Revolution 100 years ago, the slogan was land, peace, and bread. Land, peace, and bread. Irish rebellion, land and freedom. Freedom. Freedom is a very complicated word. It doesn't mean that you don't enter it and have those debates. But I think that's fundamental to journalism, is journalists should not merely be writing about current events as if the question of freedom is not at the center of our stories. What is freedom? How are people understanding freedom? What are the clashes between different understandings of freedom? What does it mean to be dignified? What is dignity? Why has somebody immolated themselves? What does that mean? Why is it that there were 500 immolations and one immolation caught the imagination of people? What does that mean? What are people searching for? I mean, if we don't ask those questions, we're dishonest. In other words, what I'm just trying to say is, who are you? A journalist, I think, has to have a perspective, has to be quite open and comfortable with it. But more than anything else, has to be honest to the people that they're listening to. I mean, honesty, I think, is a very important value for us. It's different than truth. I think honesty means when people talk to me, I shouldn't misrepresent what they're saying. I should give them the dignity to stand with what they say. Now, I may not agree with them, and I might want to argue with them. But then I should go talk to somebody else to argue with them, or find a way to give them their space but yet argue with them. So I would say, what am I? I'm all those things except perhaps a liberal humanist, because I don't want to just be a dreamer. International law is not going to be useful here. Because what if a country gives permission for you to set up a base? Then they are complicit in the setting up of the base. They have invited you to set up the base. Then it's a private relationship between two countries. Why have these 5 countries in the Sahel joined the initiative with the French? It's a good question to go and ask them. They will not answer it. By the way, you ask them, they just don't answer. The French are essentially buying these countries. I'm sorry to say, they are essentially buying them. These countries, sustained attack by International Monetary Fund and so on, over 25, 30 years, have perhaps the weakest public finances that they've ever had. Mali, public finances are in a ruinous state. You can ask Cisse and others, they will tell you directly, it's very helpful to get French money. It's amazing. I'm sorry to lay it down on the French this much, but it's amazing how much we are, let's even use the word seduced by the French presidents. Now Macron, before him. I mean, really, these guys, you saw the attack in Côte d'Ivoire. What happened in Côte d'Ivoire, and then what did the French press say about it? French press came and said it's about maintaining the integrity of the elections in Côte d'Ivoire. And the UN participated. I mean, what the hell is going on? What was the relationship between Libya and France in the 2011 war? France needs some investigation for what they've been up to in Africa. But these countries are basically at a position where they are going to do anything if money is put on the table. I did a little study in Zambia, where the Western press routinely talks about corruption in Africa. And this media thing started again about Zuma in South Africa, corrupt. And it's all very tedious in the coverage. They are corrupt politicians. They are responsible for, the butcher of South Africa is Zuma. butcher of X is butcher of Y, butcher of this. If you look at Zambia, it's one of the richest countries. It has enormous copper deposits. The copper is extracted by 5 major companies. One of them Swiss, one French, one Chinese, and I think 2 more European, Canadian, sorry, 2 more Canadian companies. Canada, most gorgeous prime minister, same old colonial policies. They extract the copper wealth. It leaves through so-called transfer pricing mechanisms and so on. Money is being skimmed out of Zambia. The re-entry of investment of copper is marginal. You ask the minister, what is the situation of children in the copper belt in Zambia? 60% cannot read. The richest country. Under Kenneth Kwanda, the previous regime, literacy rates went up. They got to, I think, some 80% literate. Now 60% children who live on top of the copper cannot read. So when you're in that situation, somebody shows up with a big, like a comic book, the sack with the thing with the dollar sign on it, plops that on your desk, you're just going to say, go ahead, you can build the base, no problem. Once you've done that, you've compromised your sovereignty. Now Malian troops from Chad, troops from Mauritania, troops from Niger are patrolling that area with American and French troops. They patrol this directly. There are drones flying above, etc. Why is this not front page news? Why is it that an American senator, I didn't know there were troops there. How could you not know? Are you deliberately lying to the public? Is the media not holding you to account about this? Should these be not the questions that are asked? Why are they there? What are they trying to do? They don't want the migrants to get to Libya. That's very much part of the French agenda. They don't want, and they are protecting Arlit. The town of Arlit, which is a Niger town, is dominated by a French uranium company called Arriva. It's a huge sign everywhere. And the town is garrisoned by the French military. It's like the bloody French Foreign Legion. It's not a free country, Niger. They have a seat at the United Nations. The president of Niger should go to the General Assembly and say, we are going to give up our seat. Let the French vote for us. Why should we even bother? You see what I mean, Rami? You open the door, and where is your sovereignty? You got to maintain your sovereignty, but you can't because your public finances are short. What does one... Look, frankly, teaching is a great profession, but personally, I just like to collect stories. And that's what I've enjoyed forever. So actually, that's the main motivation for me, is that I want to spend more time collecting stories. Like the story about the border in the Sahel. I feel like, traveling is an interesting, prospect, whatever. But there are stories that are just not being told. And increasingly, I'm finding that the continent of Africa is reported even worse than other places. That there's so much underreporting of what happens. The increase of militarism, the fact that in the Great Lakes region of Africa, millions of people have died in a war that's continuing. The fact that Europe is so embarrassed by the Rwandan genocide that nobody talks about Rwandan-backed militia groups that have basically compromised the sovereignty of Eastern Congo. These are stories to be told.
I take a little exception to a few points you've said, Vijay. And one is that you say, when has there been a struggle against military bases in the Arab world? Beirut gave a great present to America, as you well know, in the 80s. Half of Lebanon is still struggling against a military base and has never stopped. So in a sense, there hasn't been a time when this part has ever stopped fighting against occupations. You say that life must be full of dignity, and that makes sense. But actually the right to life must first exist.
Sure.
We live in the midst of wars from here to the border of China. Apart from Iran, very little else is standing, really, or on the threat of its destruction. Now, to what extent then, to go a little bit positive, I got very depressed in bits of your talk, partly because I get tired going from here to Ain al-Maraisi, where I live. You seem to be all right, traveling half the globe, you know. But
today the traffic was so bad from here to Ain al-Maraisi that...
Okay, on that little lighter point then, let's move to another thing, Vijay. That in your talk, some of the ideas that went missing in the historical context, we had an ideology of pan-Arabism, we had an ideology of pan-Africanism, and the movements that gave birth to the countries of which you wrote in The Darker Nations, and I finally read the book, that there was an era of hope, and the era of hope meant we are going to snatch our freedom back from you through the barrel of a gun, if need be necessary. This is reflected within the anti-colonial movements, particularly by the Pan-African Congress of South Africa. If you remember their slogan, "One bullet, one settler." And in a sense, all these ideological movements were missing from your talk. And perhaps there is a question, perhaps you could comment, to what extent is the era that we live in now actually more necessary to have the concept back, that if your oppression comes through the barrel of a gun, you're not necessarily going to find freedom holding a rose.
Final question.
How do you read the relationship between Tel Soud, the cooperation between Tel Soud and Al-Mayadeen today? Mayadeen being this voice of this new resistance, quote unquote.
What I found interesting about the Black Panther movie, how many people have seen it? I've seen it often, and I find it fascinating and irritating. Yes, fascinating and irritating. Fascinating because there's something in it that's quite powerful, which is the idea that there's a country in Africa that was not colonized and therefore had its own development trajectory, which was unaffected by uneven development, theft, slavery, etc. That's an interesting idea. But somehow this country missed out on the period of national liberation around it. Like Africa was not a continent of national liberation. And the fight against national liberation, from the coup against Nkrumah in February 1966, the killing of Lumumba, I mean, these things just didn't happen around Wakanda. Wakanda was there developing, and these things were happening. It was not aware of it. How is that possible? So it's true that we have vacated this in our brains, that there was this movement to produce, different futures, to produce a genuine anti-colonial logic. I always turn back to the UN resolution in 1960, before Lumumba was killed, where the UN declared in its the resolution on decolonization, that the process of decolonization is irresistible and irreversible. It's a great line. I don't know who wrote it, but it's a terrific line. The process of decolonization or liberation is irreversible and irresistible. It's a great line. I think that's true, and I think, coming to your question, the struggle always finds its voice, but you cannot always control what it looks like. The context provides a different kind of character. In other words, the skin that anti-colonialism puts on is not always of your choosing. Now, that doesn't mean one has to defend it. It just means that anti-colonialism can appear in our different times, in different contexts, wearing different skin. I didn't give the example of Beirut accidentally, or Baghdad accidentally, or Bombay. It's interesting that in all these neighborhoods, in Khartoum, in Sudan, the working class neighborhoods were the space of the Sudanese Communist Party, which was the largest communist party in Africa. But these parties were deliberately destroyed. It wasn't that, people just lost interest in it. Their leadership was killed. I gave this case. He was assassinated by the government in 1971. In this country, what's his name? Mroué was killed. Mahdi Amal was killed. The heads were cut off of the party. And then communists were slaughtered. I mean, I went and met his family, Mahdi Amal's family, and I wrote a story in Frontline in which I talked to some old-time communists. They talked about bodies of communists being thrown into the Mediterranean. That movement had to be wrecked with complete complicity of, as they used to say in the old days, certain embassies. Certain embassies are involved. We used to make this joke years ago. Why will there not be a coup in the United States? Because there's no US embassy in the US. Certain embassies, we used to have complicity. That's actually how the stories used to be written. It is said that certain embassies. What kind of language was that? Can't say it directly. The fact that Telesur and Mayadeen have a relationship is not surprising. Because, there is a certain, what is known as a kind of anti-imperialist movement that's developed. That should be written about, but not in the way in which people are doing it, where they're saying, well, some failed left or whatever. No, we got to understand what produces this as anti-imperialist. What happens in the world of social media is that it's so hard to have a conversation with anybody about any of these things. I read these clickbait things all the time. The left has failed on Syria. And then you want to ask people, what do you mean by left when you say the left has failed? In Afrin currently, the city is basically under siege by the Turks. There is one road to Aleppo that was open for a while. I believe it's closed. The Turks the other day cut the telephone lines into the city. The city is under siege. There are some left-wing anarchists, European anarchists sitting there. Kurdish government is still hoping the Americans will free them. God knows why they believe that. It's not going to happen. It's a city condemned now. What left caravan is going to go to Afrin? Do you understand what I'm saying? Is that what left has failed Syria? What left can do anything? It's a silly debate that takes place on television and this, that. So in the end of the day, let's understand what is the character of the resistance that develops. The character of the resistance that develops is what history has produced. You have imperialism and then you have all kinds of malignancies that develop. Some of them become resistances. Some of them become important at a moment to block certain things. That doesn't mean it's good, but it's blocking certain things. When the Russians entered Syria in, September 2015, it's the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union that a country has entered a conflict where the Americans had an interest and says, you cannot do this. Militarily entered. I was trying to think, if the Americans again start saying we're going to bomb Iran, will the Russians send a squadron into Tehran? Will they fly planes into Iran to say, no, you can't do this? Will the Chinese do that? If you go to Tehran, there are more Chinese cranes in the city than cranes with any other language. The Chinese have been building a ton of things in Iran. Will the Chinese send a squadron of, Now, this doesn't mean one says, well, the Chinese are the future. The question is, given the kind of suffocating world environment we have, this is what the moment produces for us. And so, obviously, therefore, Telesur, very far away in Ecuador, trying to understand what's happening in the Middle East, says Mayadeen is taking a strong position against regime change. A concept which they worry about greatly, not only in Ecuador, where, Rafael Correa has been on television defending his record and being yelled at and abused by telecasters. It's incredible. If you go online, you can watch Correa, a former president, being just disrespected completely. I mean, this is bizarre. The worry, these concepts link groups that have almost nothing in common. Different understandings of human freedom, different understandings of what it means to, be a person in the world, etc. But because the world has become so desiccated of hope and so on, these things happen. Now, then, therefore, those online debates, you know what I mean? Those, You know what I'm talking about, these online debates. Those debates are ridiculous. They are a mockery of thinking. They are people scoring points against each other. You are pro-Assad. You are al-Qaida. You are this, you are that. I mean, guys, relax. You don't know anything. You've never been anywhere and seen what these things mean. You're just having some sort of debate in the middle of the night. Take a, sleeping pill and relax for a little bit. Because your debate is not changing reality. That's for me a crucial thing. A way to intervene in the world you live in. Not argue about somebody's freedom. The fantasy about the Kurdish resistance in Rojava is extraordinary. People think, in Kurdistan, women are all free. Really? You need to travel to southwest Turkey. It's a complicated thing. Yes, the women in the PKK have fought for their freedom inside the organization. Why is it that people in southwest Turkey vote for traditionalist politicians, including traditionalist Kurdish parties? Because traditionalism is part of the society as well. You both have the YPG and you have very conservative societies at the same time. These people will read about Rojava and then they'll rush off, put on a keffiyeh, rush off to defend. I remember this in Chiapas. Chiapas became like a tourism spot for European radicals of all kinds. Chiapas is going to change the world. You change the world at home, friend. What about getting rid of your French president? Why are you out there in bloody Chiapas cheering on something you don't understand? You see, I'm not saying people shouldn't go. After all, I spent my life going. But fantasy is the real illusion. That's a real error. And I worry about now when the debate, particularly on something like Syria, is a debate of the deaf and the blind and people in fantasy. Try to understand what has been the historical development. I'm reading this interesting book called Destroying a Nation by the former Dutch envoy to Syria, Van Damme. Very interesting book. He publishes the book and then he is pilloried, Nobody takes the time to understand what he's arguing. What is the point he's making? Let's engage with what he's saying. They are arguing against him for what he hasn't said, which is Assad is a butcher. If you don't say that, you don't get a ticket to the conversation.